Normally, it's just 1 Pwnage per customer, but I just couldn't pass this up. Okay, it is time for you to learn how the world actually works, rather than how your fantasy world works. All the rest of you regressive, rand-obsessed, greedy, delusional morons can listen up and learn these lessons as well. By the way, Lee, your answer on yesterday's essay question was incomplete. Yes, we should leave the corporate tax rate as it is, just as you said. However, you left off the rest of the answer, which was that we need to close all their loopholes and go after their offshore accounts as part of an effort to enforce our tax evasion laws. Now, on to our first lesson, which is on the topic of general economic logic. You seem to think that any corporate tax is just passed on to the consumer, raising the price of goods and services. That is an example of some illogical bullshit that makes absolutely no sense. You see, a business always tries to sell their product at the highest price they can. They put it as high as they can without hurting demand to a degree that would lose them revenue. They also have to watch for their competitors undercutting their price, so demand and competition are what puts the cap on their price, and that is what they set it to because they want to get the most for their product. So it's really illogical to think a business is going to add tax to their price if there is an increase. Nobody wants to be the first to raise it because of losing customers to the competition. You also are not going to add to the price when that is going to hurt demand, resulting in lost sales and less revenue. Companies can't whimsically set their prices willy-nilly, not if they want to stay in business anyway. Same thing goes with hiring and firing. The vast majority of changes in staffing are driven by business levels. If a business is expanding, they need more workers. If they are losing sales, they need less. Why would any CEO with half a brain fire people to make up for tax increases? He's not going to have the staff to maintain his current output, let alone grow his business. If a business can get by without certain staff, they get rid of them. They don't keep extras around that they can shed because of taxes. You also seem to think increases in government tax revenue will just lead to a bunch of pork spending rather than balancing the budget. That's obviously quite an assumption, but let's suppose it's true for the moment. Is never raising taxes really the way to solve the pork problem? Logically, you would think passing legislation banning pork spending would be the remedy if you were concerned about that. Your way is kind of like locking your kids out of the house to keep them from stealing a cookie when you could just put the jar where they can't reach it. Very illogical. Hopefully this illustrates the value of, I don't know, having some common fucking sense. Next up is a lesson in consistency. You were talking about how the VAT, or value added tax, which is a consumption tax, is bad because it increases the costs of goods and services. Then, only a few minutes later, you were talking about how much you like the fair tax, which is another consumption tax that will increase the cost of goods and services. So, which is it? Is consumption tax the way to go, or is it bad for the economy? You see, that is a lack of consistency. The first step towards being more consistent is not to contradict yourself. So that will be your homework assignment, to just try not to contradict something you said just a couple minutes before that. Next is a lesson about hypocrisy. I think you must not realize hypocrisy is a negative trait people tend to frown on. Let me illustrate something for you.
Now, you are right to say that there is a philosophical issue with taxes. There is something inherently wrong with a bunch of people, in many instances, saying, you know what, we should increase taxes on other people so that we can then get more services for ourselves. And we are now going to protest in the streets or vote for certain candidates that are going to demand that we take money from other people and then fund our services.
See how that works? You rail on the poor and middle class because of them attempting to do just that in your fantasy world. Yet that's what the rich are trying to do in reality, and they are deploying their dumb herd of sheep to help them do it. You seem to be okay with that. That double standard is what we call hypocrisy. The final lesson is on tax and its relation to economics. First, let's correct your errors on the 2 essay questions on viable tax proposals from yesterday. The flat tax may sound fair with everyone paying the same percentage, but in reality it isn't. This has a lot to do with the immense income disparity. Over the last 40 years, the ratio between the lowest and highest paid workers in a company has grown to about 10 times what it was. There is a greater and greater share of all the wealth held by a smaller and smaller group of people, so there is a huge difference between someone who spends 1% of their income on the bare essentials paying a 15% flat tax rate and someone who spends 90% of their income on the bare essentials paying 15%. Then having nothing but the standard exemptions makes it impossible to take into consideration the situation different people are in. Someone may have less ability to pay than their income indicates. It's also possible to simplify the tax code without completely gutting it. The second one was about the fair tax. The fair tax is anything but fair. It greatly shifts the tax burden from the wealthy to the poor and middle class. It's simply a matter of the rich spending little of their money on taxable things and everyone else spending a great deal of their money on them. Rebates related to the poverty level will do little to help this. This might prevent the poor from being involved in food riots, but that's about it. You still have the tax burden shifted much more towards the poorest people. The next problem is that it's a consumption tax, which is bad for business. Increased costs of products lowers demand and sales. That's basic economics. When businesses sell less, they lay off workers. Then the unemployment rate goes up and the consumer base has even less money to spend on products, and this in turn means a lower dollar amount in tax revenue. Now, let's move on to the main part of this final lesson where I simply explain taxes as they relate to the economy in general. You base your entire philosophy on the premise that the wealthy will create jobs and pay workers more when they get tax cuts. But even if you lower corporate taxes as well as the personal taxes of the wealthy, you are not going to get more jobs and prosperity, just like increasing taxes won't cause a loss in jobs and prosperity. A company is not going to hire more workers or pay them more just for the hell of it because they got a tax cut. That makes no sense. The only way that could work is if you were selling all your products to yourself. The only thing that makes a business hire more people is an expansion in their business. They will only hire when they need more labor to cover their increased output. The only thing that is going to make a business expand is increased sales. So what a business does is entirely dependent on their consumers. Even companies that provide goods and services to other companies are ultimately dependent on the end consumer. When you follow the chain of business customers, you ultimately end up with businesses who directly serve consumers. So the only thing that is going to increase sales and, in turn, jobs is consumers buying more stuff. So what does a consumer need to buy stuff? They must have demand and capital. Demand is not a problem. However, capital is a problem. It is an increasingly larger problem the poorer someone is. So by shifting the tax burden away from the bottom, you have more capital in the hands of people with unmet demand due to their prior lack of capital. This increase in sales causes business to expand. This makes it necessary to hire more labor to meet this new demand. This further adds to the buying power of the consumer base. The increase in demand for labor will also increase wages. It will also make certain kinds of labor more scarce. More demand and less supply means the cost of labor goes up, so people make more money. This adds even more buying power to the consumer base. The current system where the burden is shifted down towards the bottom just causes speculative investments, which brings about boom and bust economic cycles. That is very bad for economic stability. It also leaches capital away from the consumer base, causing stagnation in business. This concludes today's lessons. Hopefully now you understand the way the world actually works in reality is very different from the way it works in Fantasyland.